sanctions in exchange for Kim's offer to only shut down his main nuclear fuel factory, and President Trump walked away.
Sometimes you have to walk, and this was just one of those times.
North Korea says they only requested a partial lifting of sanctions. A planned signing ceremony was canceled, along with lunch, and Kim was left feeling bewildered, a source tells CNN. Today, President Trump held out hope the relationship he once described as falling in love won't now fall apart.
I would be surprised in a negative way if he did anything that was not per our understanding, but we'll see what happens.
Analysts say what's happening does not appear to be positive. At this North Korean facility, where rockets are tested, satellite photos show new activity. Kim had been dismantling it last year after tensions with the U.S. began to thaw. But by Saturday, the walls had been rebuilt, and by Wednesday, the roof was restored. A State Department official says the U.S. has not yet determined whether the site is now operational again, but is watching it closely and will ask North Korea for an explanation. Analysts say the big question now is whether the two leaders' relationship is broken or if they'll try to patch things up and reach a deal again.
What comes next? Was the Hanoi summit end of chapter 1 of diplomacy between the two countries, or was it the end of diplomacy between these two countries? And does something much worse, frankly, come next?
And here in Beijing, Chinese authorities have taken notice of what happened in Hanoi. Sources are telling CNN that Chinese President Xi Jinping is no longer planning to travel to the United States to Mar-a-Lago at the end of this month, which had been reported. The reason? They don't want President Trump to walk out on President Xi like he walked out on Kim Jong-un. That would be a diplomatic catastrophe in the eyes of the Chinese, and it is further evidence that, at least in this part of the world, President Trump's diplomatic credibility has been undermined because of him walking out in Hanoi. Victor, Christie.
All right, Will Ripley for us in Beijing. Will, thank you.
Now, President Trump has held up the pause in testing as a sign of progress here. If North Korea is making these moves to get the White House's attention, as some analysts say it's possible, the question is, has it worked? We want to bring in CNN White House reporter Sarah Westwood. What are you hearing from there in West Palm Beach this morning?
Well, good morning, Christy and Victor. And the White House still not responding to this reported activity at this facility in North Korea. President Trump saying yesterday, as you mentioned, that he would be surprised in a negative way if North Korea were to resume its testing of missiles. Recall that this administration has held up the pause in missile tests and nuclear tests and other provocative activity from North Korea as a top point of pride, as progress in itself from the president's inaugural summit with Kim Jong-un in Singapore last year. So if those tests were to resume, that could be a blow to the president's strategy when it comes to North Korea, the credibility of which is based on the fact that these tests have stopped. Now, the president's national security advisor, John Bolton, said on Thursday that the president is still open to further talks with North Korea. The prospect of a third summit with Kim Jong-un was sort of left up in the air after the president departed Vietnam just over a week ago. But of course, if North Korea is, in fact, re-engaging in that provocative behavior, it's unclear if denuclearization talks would continue. Victor and Christy.
All righty, Sarah Westwood, appreciate the update. Thank you.
All right, to talk about the political repercussions and consequences, let's talk to Karen Demersion, congressional reporter at the Washington Post. Karen, good morning.
Good morning, Victor.
So the president has used the lack of missile and nuclear tests to justify continued engagement as a measure of success of his talks with Kim. If there is a missile test or a satellite test, which previous presidents have seen as provocative, what politically is the consequence for the president?
It makes the gambit of this summit, not the gambit of talking to North Korea, not the gambit of trying to resolve the standoff over their nuclear weapons, but the strategy that he used in going to two high-profile summits, one more so than the last, open to question. It's been open to question this whole time, but his critics have really kept their own counsel, or tried to for the most part, because everybody wanted it to work, if it could work. And it was an orthodox strategy to put the North Korean leader on such a public stage and legitimize him so much as to put him next to the American president multiple times. But that was kind of held closer to the chest than there's any incentive to do now, if this is a strategy that either so fully damaged the relationship that it can't be resuscitated, or has really put the progress on its back foot in terms of being able to move forward in the actual substantive negotiations, whether or not we get to watch that on TV cameras or it happens behind closed doors.
So let's talk about that progress. A senior State Department official held a background briefing this week and said, and let's put it up on the screen, nobody in the administration advocates a step-by-step approach. In all cases, the expectation is a complete denuclearization of North Korea as a condition for all the other steps being taken. How plausible is that they'll get full denuclearization, although they have not yet defined the term, before anything else happens?
Well, I mean, not plausible given what we saw happen after Hanoi, which is that the North Koreans are making hard demands and wanting a lifting of all sanctions and at the outset of doing this. So you have both sides saying, well, you give me a very, very clear and very, very expansive gesture of everything I want before I do what you're asking me to do. And that's a difficult way to get through a negotiation. I mean, on the bright side, it's not, sometimes you need these things to fall apart a few times for people to realize that they really don't want to just retreat to their corners, that their best alternative is to negotiate something even if it's not perfect. So a negotiation this high stakes, this complicated, is not going to just work like that at the first time. But if the fact that it seems like people on both sides, the leaders on both sides, are still talking to their own countries at this point versus putting out proposals that would be technically negotiation in public, which I'm sure they don't want to do, but actually coming closer towards the middle. It doesn't sound like that's happening.
So let's talk about the residual impact as it relates to President Xi of China. Will Ripley just reporting there that Xi will not be coming to the U.S. by the end of the month for this signing summit at Mar-a-Lago for a trade deal. In part, the uncertainty is fueled by the president walking away from the table with Kim in Hanoi. How does that play for the president? That now you've got China saying, well, he walked away from that, maybe he'll walk away from me.
I mean, it's a political move by the Chinese to say that in the first place, but it shows that there's repercussions for anything that the American president does wherever he is in the world, dealing with countries big or small, aggressive or competitors. And I mean, look, the president has put a pause button on rolling out the full extent of the tariffs and other trade measures that he was threatening to do because he thought that he could renegotiate things with China. That slows that down. It begs the question of what will Trump then do if he's not going to have those face-to-face talks with the Chinese leader. And it also begs the question of, what then happens elsewhere in the region. I mean, China has been a vital link for North Korea, and it's also been a vital leverage point for the United States in trying to get North Korea to the table. And there's always other things happening, right? China, it asserts leverage over North Korea. Currently, we have scaled down our exercises with South Korea. You can't silo off any of these relationships from the other, both because of how the countries want to be perceived themselves, but also because if you have a slowdown, probably this is not a complete breakdown with China, but even a slowdown and a pullback suggests that it might be more complicated to talk not just about the bilateral issues, but about the regional multilateral issues, which are also so important. So you can't do any of these things in a vacuum. Everybody's watching and thinking about how to recalculate what their bottom line is, given what people did with other leaders and on other fronts.
All right, we'll see if there's progress on either front. Karen Demersion, thanks so much.
Thank you.
And we have a reminder for you. Live from South by Southwest in Austin, Texas, 3 CNN presidential town halls back to back for you. First of all, former Congressman John Delaney at 7, Representative Tulsi Gabbard at 8, and Mayor Pete Buttigieg at 9. CNN's Jake Tapper and Dana Bash are moderating. That is tomorrow night, Sunday, starting at 7 p.m. Eastern, only here on CNN.
Empire acts of disorderly conduct. We'll break down the legal implications with our legal analyst. That's coming up next.
Also, former Trump chairman Paul Manafort getting ready for a second sentencing. We're taking a look at what he could face next week.
Also, the February jobs report was the weakest in months. What this tells us about the state of the economy. That's ahead.
Chicago. Now, the 2 men who were detained in connection with the incident have been cooperating with police, and they say Smollett paid them $3,500 to stage the attack. Mark Garagos, one of Smollett's attorneys, said the actor maintains his innocence and calls the indictment prosecutorial overkill. CNN legal analyst and criminal defense attorney Joey Jackson with us now. Joey, what do you make of that? Do you see prosecutorial overkill here?
Good morning to you, Christy. You know, I see prosecutors who are motivated to get to the bottom of what occurred. Mark Geragos, an outstanding attorney and a very good individual, I might add, a colleague here, obviously, at CNN. You know, look, the prosecutors, what they did is they took out every particular factual statement that Mr. Smollett made, and they made it into a crime. So essentially, the counts that you see in the indictment, he spoke to one officer initially and told them a variety of things as to what occurred, and those things that he told them, right, being attacked by masked men, it being a hate crime, the noose around his neck, they made each and every one, that is the prosecutors, a false statement, a false report. Then again, he met with a detective and at that time reiterated the story, adding some details, and prosecutors did that again. Did they need 16 counts? I don't think so. I think, you know, Mark certainly has a point as it relates to prosecutors being overzealous here, but, you know, at the end of the day, it matters little. The fact is all you need is one count for conviction, and the evidence in this case appears to be somewhat compelling. The stuff that we know. So.
Sure. And based on what we know, how reliable do you see these two witnesses?
You know, I think
the brothers.
What happens, Christy, and that's the great question, and that's the essence of the question, but how reliable you see someone always depends upon whether they're corroborated. And from what we know, and again, I'm relying upon press reports, haven't examined the evidence, haven't, you know, Mark Geragos has the evidence or certainly will get the evidence, so he'll be able to examine it. But you don't have to rely upon someone's word. What do I mean? We see that the two are talking to the police as to what occurred. The police are not just saying, oh, is that what happened? Really? Let's march you in front of the grand jury and then we'll take you to trial. No, they're evaluating. So they go and they say, hey, we went to the store and we picked up the mask and we picked up the rope and we got the bleach and all we need. Where do police go? They go to the store. We have surveillance video from them being in the store. You know what else he did? He paid us with a check. It was $3,500. What do police do? They go and get the check. The argument, of course, is that, oh, those were for personal training services. That's for a jury to vet out. But when you talk about credibility, when you have that credibility matched up against evidence, it's hard to argue that someone's lying.
Joey, I got to play this from defense attorney Mark Geragos. Here's something else he brought up yesterday. Listen to this.
What is happening here is, frankly, a media gangbang of this guy of unprecedented proportions. And that's the reason I got into this. I've never seen a media pendulum swing more quickly and more viciously and rob somebody of their presumption of innocence like this case. It's startling the way people assume that he's guilty.
He brings up that bigger issue of innocent until proven guilty and the fact that that seems to be, to some degree, with a lot of people absent here. Your thoughts?
You know, Christy, everyone has the presumption of innocence, and as a defense attorney, I'll stand by that every day and twice on Sunday. You're presumed innocent until proven guilty. A judge will instruct the jury every time they leave that room. Do not make any conclusions. Do not draw any conclusions. Having said that, why is this in the public discourse? Why are we speaking about it? Because of the nature of what was reported. Because of the fact that you say you're attacked. The fact that you say this is MAGA country. The fact that they called you, you know, epithets that relate to your sexual orientation. And so obviously it's a case that resonated and the police took seriously. And then they put 12 detectives on it. They spent 1,000 man hours and they uncover that it just ain't so. And so, yes, it's out there. Yes, people have attitudes about it, but that's in large measure to Jussie Smollett himself. Let's be clear. Let's be honest about the narrative that he put out there about the police trying to get to the bottom of, oh my goodness, how could this ever occur? Let's catch the person. And then when you go and catch them, you track the two people down. They don't happen to be white. They happen to be black. You discuss it with the people after you arrest them. You say, I'm not going to arrest them. You detain them. You learn their story. You learn that they were paid for it, allegedly, and the story unravels. So, yes, it's something that we're all, you know, people are really motivated to speak about, but that is in large measure to the narrative that Smollett himself put out there concerning what happened to him.
All right. Joey Jackson, it's always so good to get your perspective, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Christy.
Absolutely not.
Have you ever had sex
No.
with anyone under the age of 17?
No.
Never.
No.
So what they say is you like very much being in control, and if you're not in control, it becomes very bad for the woman in the relationship.
Oh, you say me? I
Yeah,
like to be?
yeah.
No. See, the thing is that I'm not a controlling person. It's just that I am in control of my household. Like, say, if you live with me, I consider myself the king of the castle, and you're the queen of the castle.
If he's convicted, Kelly could face between 3 and 7 years in prison for each of those 10 counts.
Tough week ahead for the president's former campaign chairman, Paul Manafort. Critics say he was handed a light sentence this week in Virginia, but next week he could face a very different fate in a Washington, D.C. court. That's coming up.
Plus, traveling to Europe without a visa will be a thing of the past come 2021. Coming up, the travel restrictions are changing for the European Union.
28 minutes past the hour. Oh, it's early.
It is.
An early Saturday today, isn't it?
Early.
We're glad that you're up. I'm Christy Paul.
I'm Victor Blackwell. Good to be with you. Paul Manafort's time in jail could be extended potentially significantly in the next week because on Thursday, Manafort, was sentenced to nearly 4 years in prison, far less than the recommended federal guidelines of 19 to 24 and a half years.
But that's still the most significant punishment in any case brought by the special prosecutor's office thus far. And next week, things could get a lot worse for Mr. Manafort. CNN's Sarah Murray reports.
Critics say Paul Manafort got off easy. But next week, he'll come face to face with another judge who may take a harsher view of Manafort's crimes.
I'm surprised at the sentence.
Judge Amy Berman Jackson is set to sentence Manafort for conspiracy and witness tampering, crimes that carry a maximum sentence of 10 years. In deciding whether to impose that maximum sentence, Jackson could also weigh the fact that Manafort continued to commit crimes even after he was arrested, and later lied to investigators when he was supposed to be cooperating. A federal judge in Virginia Thursday sentenced Manafort, President Trump's former campaign chairman, to nearly 4 years in prison, far less than the recommended sentence of 19 to 25 years.
This sentence, in my view, failed to do justice to the very serious crimes that Manafort has committed, as well as his utter disrespect for the law.
The comments Manafort's lawyer made after his client's sentencing only further inflamed Democrats.
There is absolutely no evidence that Paul Manafort was involved with any collusion with any government official from Russia.
The Intelligence Committee
Adam Schiff, the Democrat chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, fired back via Twitter, saying the statement by Paul Manafort's lawyer after an already lenient sentence, repeating the president's mantra of no collusion, was no accident. It was a deliberate appeal for a pardon. In deciding Manafort's sentence, Judge T.S. Ellis called the recommendations excessive. Life. But his resume shows a complicated picture. As anti-Semitic, according to court documents. For their part, prosecutors reached back nearly a decade to document Manafort's history of tax fraud, hiding foreign bank accounts, and defrauding banks, leading to his 8 convictions in Virginia. Now, even though the maximum that Paul Manafort could face when he's sentenced in D.C. is 10 years, it'll be more difficult for Manafort and his legal team to make the argument that the judge should not give him this maximum sentence. And that's because, unlike Virginia, he actually pleaded guilty to the charges he was facing in D.C. And as part of that plea agreement, he acknowledged a number of other crimes that he was never even charged with. He even signed a document that, of course, prosecutors have, saying he deserved 17 to 22 years in prison. Sarah Murray, CNN, Washington.
Well, starting in 2021, U.S. citizens will need a travel visa to visit most European countries. The European Union is implementing increased security measures, and Americans will need a new type of visa to travel through its 26 member nations. Right now, Americans can travel through Europe for up to 90 days with only a passport. To apply for the new travel visas, Americans will need a passport, credit or debit card, and an email account. The visas will be valid for 3 years.
Tough jobs report for the U.S. economy. What does it say about the health of what's going on in the economy today and whether the president's policies are helping, whether they're hurting? CNN Business is breaking down some of those numbers. We'll talk about it in a moment. Stay close.
My experience with USA Air has been excellent. They really appreciate the military family, and it really shows.
That it halted the gains that we've been seeing in recent months. The government said thousands of people just couldn't work because of the weather. particularly in industries such as construction and hospitality.
The unemployment rate dropped to 3.8%, and wages grew 3.4% from a year ago. Now, average hourly earnings have been consistently stronger the past few months, but economists are concerned if that pace is sustainable.
So CNN business senior writer Lydia DePillis is with us now. Lydia, so good to see you. Is there any other evidence that the economy has been slowing other than these jobs numbers that we saw in the last 24 hours?
Yeah, so economists have been expecting a slowdown to hit for a while now. It's been happening globally for many months, particularly in China. There's been a manufacturing slowdown, trade is declining. And so there's been a question about when this is going to happen in the United States after a really amazing 2018. That is starting to show up in housing purchases and sales, in retail sales, a really bad number in December. Things like loan demand are down. But on the other hand, we haven't seen it hit right quite yet. There are some positive signs. Productivity is growing. That's a really great sign for the economy. It means that those wage gains may actually be sustained even as companies start to look around the corner.
So we're seeing a foreshadow, not a plot point just yet. We're starting to see the hint of it coming. So yesterday, Lydia, the president, he really shrugged off the jobs report, at least the growth number of just the hard jobs. And he says the economy is doing well. Watch.
The economy is very, very strong. If you look at the stock market over the last few months, it's been great. And certainly since my election, it's up getting close to 50%, the stock market. So we're obviously very happy with that.
The president obviously will take credit for all of that, but how much should he take credit for, considering his policies over the last 2 years?
Well, the president conveniently left out the giant dive in the stock market at the end of last year, from which we're basically almost recovered. But it is appropriate to give him some credit for the stimulus of tax cuts and increased government spending, which led to what some call artificially high growth in 2018, which is why we're coming off of those highs. Now, businesses have been complaining about the uncertainty he's created with a trade war. Most of that has been a small drag. Most of the fears were around that escalating, which have been alleviated recently with the good talks with China. But people are still looking for things like an infrastructure bill or an increase in high-skilled immigration. Those are the kinds of things that would really help the economy down the line.
Of course, we know this morning that Chinese officials say there's no longer this planned summit with President Xi Jinping of China, so we'll wait and see where that goes in terms of trade. That was a concern. But when we look at the Fed and their meeting in 2 weeks, how likely will they hold off further rate hikes?
The Fed has said that it is going to be, quote, patient with rate hikes. Most people expect that means they will not hike in March. Now, the recent economic data lends credence to that. It sounds like this gives them good reason to hold off, which will be very comforting to many businesses.
No doubt. All righty. Hey, Lydia DePillis, good to have you with us. Thank you.
No problem.
Sure.
All right, let's go to Allison Chinchar now, watching some severe weather moving through parts of the country. Allison, I spent half the week in Alabama after those fatal tornadoes. Are we expecting anything like that this weekend?
Unfortunately, we are, and we're already starting to see a lot of those storms beginning to fire up already this morning. We'll break it down, what areas are likely to see the worst severe weather coming up.
It'll be another dangerous weekend for nearly 15 million Americans who are under a threat of severe weather this weekend.
Yeah, it comes nearly a week, of course, after those deadly tornadoes ripped through Alabama, through Georgia. CNN meteorologist Allison Chinchar with us now. Do you anticipate, Allison, it will be as bad as we've seen this past week?
Unfortunately, yes, the forecast is calling for that. Some very strong, violent tornadoes that are expected through this area. Now, we absolutely hope and pray that the death toll remains at 0 for this particular event, but the dynamics are there for this to be a very strong system as it continues to push east. We're already starting to see some very strong storms develop even at this hour, and the sun has not even risen for a lot of these places. That's going to be the problem going forward. As the sun rises, you will get that heating of the day that will allow for a lot more of these storms to fire up and also intensify. Because of that, we have a severe thunderstorm watch in effect from Missouri back down through portions of Texas. Large hail is going to be the initial concern, but as we get that heating of the day, that will help develop into more of the threat for tornadoes, as well as some damaging winds. Here's a look at those storms as they again continue to progress throughout the afternoon. Places like Memphis, Nashville, Little Rock, and even Jackson, Mississippi, those are going to be the target points for today. The timeline for those, a lot of cases, is going to be in the afternoon, and especially as we go into the early evening hours as the storm moves through. But take a city like Nashville, for example. You're going to have multiple rounds of this moving through, and each one of those rounds has the potential to have strong to severe storms with it. So this isn't going to be one quick, it's in, it's out, and we're all done. Very much like last Sunday where they had multiple rounds of storms, that's going to be the case today. Now, when we talk about last Sunday, there were 37 tornadoes from last Sunday's outbreak. That was an enhanced risk, just like the forecast calls for this particular outbreak. We had 5 is what the average is for Mississippi, 5 for the month of March in Georgia, and South Carolina averages about 3 in the month of March. Here's the thing. They got more than that, a month's worth of tornadoes in just that one event. But how does this compare to March overall as a whole? Here's the thing. Overall, the month of March typically has about 78 tornadoes. So we picked up nearly half of that average from just that one outbreak this past Sunday. Now, the thing going forward is when we talk about the rest of the year, it only gets worse from here because, Victor and Christy, when you look at